I didn't think much of staying late that night. It was something I did often enough, locking up the gym after practice, sweeping the court one last time, turning off the lights that hummed too loud in the silence. The team had gone home hours before. The building was mine again, the way it always was at the end of the day. Just me and the echoes. I was 34 years old, and I had spent more of my life in that gym than I cared to admit. I'd played there once, back when my knees were younger and my future felt wide open. Now I taught history during the day and coached basketball in the evenings. Assistant coach, technically. I helped out. I stayed useful. I stayed. The rain had started sometime after sunset, tapping against the tall windows that lined the far wall. It was a winter rain, the kind that made the world outside feel distant and blurred. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in that sterile glow that made even familiar spaces feel slightly unreal. The floor gleamed under my feet as I pushed the broom across it in long, even strokes. I liked the rhythm of it. The repetition. It kept my mind quiet. Elias was still there too. He was new, only a few months into the job, and he had a habit of lingering after everyone else left. He said he liked helping out. I didn't mind. He was good with the kids, energetic in a way I no longer was. 26, maybe 27. Still young enough to believe in things. He was collecting basketballs from the far end of the court, moving between the racks with an ease that reminded me of someone I used to be. I watched him for a moment without meaning to. He had this way of existing in a room that made it feel less empty. I couldn't explain it better than that. We didn't talk much while we worked. The silence between us had always been comfortable, or at least I thought it was. He moved, I moved. The sound of the rain filled in the gaps. I told myself I was just finishing up so I could go home. Lock the doors. Drive through the wet streets to my quiet apartment. The same routine I'd followed for years. I was halfway to the exit, keys already in my hand, when I felt his presence shift behind me, closer than before. Then his hand found my wrist. Not rough, not sudden, just there. His fingers wrapped around me with a kind of gentleness that made my breath catch before I could stop it. He said, "Wait." He said, "Don't go yet." I froze. I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there, staring at the double doors ahead of me, the rain streaking down the small windows set into the metal. My pulse was louder than the rain, louder than the clock ticking somewhere on the wall behind us. I could feel the warmth of his hand through my sleeve, the steadiness of it. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what he wanted me to say. The world outside had gone dark. The parking lot was empty. The streetlights barely reached the edge of the building. It was just us, standing in the middle of that wide, hollow space, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I couldn't predict what would happen next. I turned slowly, finally meeting his eyes. He was looking at me the way people do when they're about to say something they've been holding back for too long. I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself more times than I could count, but I didn't let him speak. I didn't let myself speak either. I just stood there, caught between the door and him, between leaving and staying, between the person I'd been pretending to be and whoever I actually was underneath all of it. The rain kept falling. The lights kept humming. And somewhere deep in my chest, something I'd buried a long time ago began to stir. I didn't leave. Not yet. My life had always been quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but controlled. Predictable in the way that safety often is. I taught American history to teenagers who barely looked up from their phones, and in the evenings I helped coach the basketball team. The routine was deliberate. It kept me occupied without requiring me to be seen. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, the kind of place that still had carpet from the 90s and a kitchen window that looked out onto a parking lot. The second bedroom had become a storage space for things I couldn't quite throw away. Old trophies lined the bookshelf, their brass plates tarnished but still legible. There were newspaper clippings too, yellowed and brittle, tucked into frames I never hung. Headlines about the kid who might have made it. The local prodigy. The scholarship athlete. I was 17 when I tore my ACL during the state semifinals. The injury wasn't career-ending, not technically. I could have rehabbed. I could have still gone to college, still played. But something in me had already started to shut down before the injury ever happened. I just didn't know how to name it back then. So I stayed. I came back to this town after a single semester away, and I never left again. I told people it was about family, about responsibility. My mother needed help. My father had died young. It was easier to let them believe the story I gave them than to admit I didn't know what the truth was. Every Sunday, I had dinner with my mother in the same house I grew up in. She made pot roast or chicken, something that filled the kitchen with warmth, and she asked the same questions she'd been asking for years. Was I seeing anyone? Did I have plans for the holidays? Had I thought about moving closer to the city? I answered in ways that satisfied her without revealing anything. I was good at that. At school, my colleagues assumed I was married to my work. They joked about it sometimes, in the break room, over coffee that was always too weak. Julian never takes a day off. Julian's always here. I smiled when they said it. I let them think dedication was the reason. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. I didn't know how to want things. Or maybe I did, but I'd gotten so good at not wanting them that it felt the same as not having the desire at all. I drank my coffee from the same diner every morning, walked the same route to the school parking lot, tucked my shirt in the same way before entering the gym. These small rituals held me together. They made me invisible in the way I needed to be. Then Elias arrived. He was hired in late September to teach physical education and assist with the athletics program. I'd seen his resume in the staff lounge before he started. 26 years old. Degree from a university 2 states over. Previous experience coaching at a larger school in a city I'd only been to once. He'd left that job suddenly, the principal said, but his references were solid. Sometimes people just need a fresh start. I didn't think much of it. Teachers came and went. Most didn't last long in a town this small. But Elias was different from the beginning. He was open in a way that seemed almost reckless. He talked to everyone, students and staff alike, with the same easy warmth. He told stories about his old school, about the city, about growing up in a family that moved constantly. He made people laugh without trying. Within a week, he was everyone's favorite new hire. I watched him from a distance at first. He had a way of moving through the world that I didn't understand. Unguarded. Present. He didn't seem to be performing the way the rest of us were. He didn't smooth over his rough edges or apologize for taking up space. He just existed, fully, and people responded to it. Our routines began to overlap without either of us planning it. We both had planning periods in the late morning, and we both used the same cramped office near the gym to grade papers. At first, we worked in silence, the scratch of pens and the hum of the old desktop computer filling the space between us. But eventually he started talking. Small things at first. Questions about the team, about the kids, about how long I'd been teaching. I answered carefully, the way I always did, giving just enough to seem polite without offering anything real. But he kept asking, not in a way that felt intrusive, just curious, interested. And slowly, I started answering more fully. I told him about the team's strengths, about which players needed extra attention, about how the gym felt different at night when everyone was gone. He listened in a way that made me believe he actually cared about the answers. After practice, we fell into the habit of walking out to the parking lot together. The conversations stretched longer. He told me about the city he'd left, about how overwhelming it had been, how he'd needed to get away. He didn't say why, not directly, but I could hear something underneath his words. A kind of exhaustion, a need for silence. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. Some nights, he stayed late to help clean up. He said he didn't mind. He said he liked the rhythm of it, the way the gym felt when it was empty. I didn't tell him I felt the same way. I didn't tell him that I'd started listening for his voice in the hallways during the day, or that I noticed when he wasn't there. I didn't tell him that his presence had started to feel like something I relied on, even though I didn't understand why. There were moments that lasted too long. A shared glance across the court during practice. The brush of his shoulder against mine when we stood too close while demonstrating a drill. The way he laughed at something I said, like I'd surprised him. These moments accumulated quietly, building into something I couldn't name. At night, I walked through my apartment in the dark, unable to sleep. I'd stand at the window and look out at the empty parking lot, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I'd think about the way Elias had looked at me that evening, the way his hand had felt on my wrist, and I'd feel something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not quite fear, not quite hope, something in between. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was reading into things that weren't there, that this was just what friendship felt like when you'd been alone for too long. But late at night, when I was too tired to lie to myself, I knew better. Something was shifting. Something I'd kept buried for so long, I'd almost forgotten it was there. And for the first time in years, I didn't know if I had the strength to keep it hidden. The final game of the season fell on a Friday night in late January. The gym was packed in a way it rarely was. Parents and students crowding the bleachers, their voices echoing off the walls in a constant hum of noise. The team played well. We won by 12 points. Afterward, there was talk of a celebration, something informal at the diner downtown where everyone gathered after games. I'd already decided not to go. I always decided not to go. These things were easier to avoid than to endure. Too many questions, too much forced conversation, too many hours of pretending to be comfortable in my own skin. I had my excuses ready. Papers to grade. An early morning. The usual deflections that no one questioned anymore. But Elias found me near the locker rooms as I was collecting the last of the equipment. He was still in his coaching jacket, hair damp with sweat, smiling in that easy way he had. He asked if I was coming to the dinner. His voice was casual, but there was something underneath it. An expectation, maybe, or hope. I told him I couldn't make it. The words came out smooth, practiced. I didn't even have to think about them anymore. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected the answer but was disappointed anyway. Then he said something that caught me off guard. He said, maybe another time then. Or just us. Just us. The simplicity of it threw me. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and told him we'd see. He didn't push. He never pushed. He just nodded again and walked away, back toward the noise of the gym where people were still celebrating. I finished cleaning up alone, the sounds of the crowd fading as families filtered out into the parking lot. By the time I locked the equipment room, the building was nearly empty. I expected to leave, to drive home and sit in my quiet apartment and forget the whole evening. But when I came back into the gym, Elias was there. He was picking up discarded water bottles near the benches, folding towels that had been left in careless piles. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and he smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to still be there. He said he figured I could use the help. I didn't argue. We moved around each other in the familiar silence, collecting the debris of the evening. Plastic cups, forgotten jackets, a single sneaker someone had left under the bleachers. The work was mindless, rhythmic, and I was grateful for it. It kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering too far. We didn't talk much at first. Just small comments about the game, about how well the team had played, about the relief of the season being over. But the silence between the words felt different than it usually did. Heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I was reaching for a stray basketball near the far corner of the court when his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't accidental. I knew that immediately. His fingers grazed my knuckles, lingered there for half a second longer than necessary, and then pulled away. Neither of us moved. I stood there, frozen, the ball in my hand, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. The gym felt enormous suddenly, like we were the only two people left in the world. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The rain had started again outside, tapping against the windows in that same lonely rhythm from before. Elias turned to face me fully. He didn't step back. He didn't apologize. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something soft and serious and unbearably direct. Then he said it, the thing I'd been afraid he would say, the thing I'd been hoping he wouldn't. He said, "You don't have to go yet." The words hung in the air between us, simple and impossible. I felt the weight of them settle in my chest, pressing against something I'd kept locked away for so long I'd almost forgotten it was there. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. I wanted to pretend I didn't understand what he was really asking. But I didn't move. Instead, I stayed. We both did. We stood there in the middle of that empty gym, the rain falling harder now, the sound of it drowning out everything else. And then, slowly, carefully, we started talking. Not about anything important. Just small things. The team's chances next season. The weather. The way the building always felt different at night. But underneath the words, there was something else happening. A kind of conversation we weren't having out loud. An acknowledgement of something neither of us was ready to name. I noticed things I'd been trying not to notice. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he stood just a little closer than necessary. The way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like falling, that this wasn't just in my head. He felt it too. The thought terrified me. Eventually, we finished cleaning. There was nothing left to do, no reason to stay. I told him I needed to lock up. He nodded, picking up his jacket from the bench. We walked toward the exit together, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the door, he paused. He turned to look at me one more time, and there was something in his expression that made my breath catch. Something vulnerable and uncertain and achingly honest. He said, "Thanks for staying." I told him it was nothing, that I was here anyway, that it wasn't a big deal. But we both knew I was lying. That night, I drove home through streets slick with rain, the wipers on my windshield barely keeping up with the downpour. I parked in my usual spot, climbed the stairs to my apartment, and stood in the doorway for a long time before turning on the lights. Inside, I made coffee I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall, the radio playing softly in the background. I tried to think about anything else. Lesson plans, grading, the groceries I needed to pick up over the weekend. But all I could think about was the way his hand had felt against mine, the way he'd looked at me in that empty gym, the way he'd asked me to stay, and the way I had. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark and listened to the rain and tried to understand what was happening to me. Tried to name the thing I'd been running from my entire life. The thing I'd buried so deep I thought I'd never have to face it. But it was there now. Undeniable. Relentless. And I didn't know what to do with it. The weeks that followed were different. Not in any way I could point to directly, but in the small shifts that accumulate until you realize the landscape has changed entirely. Elias and I fell into a new rhythm, one that felt both natural and impossibly fragile. Our morning greetings in the hallway lasted longer. We found reasons to stay in the shared office after our planning periods ended, talking about nothing and everything. He told me about the books he was reading, about the music he listened to on his drive to work. I found myself offering pieces of my own life in return, small things I'd never shared with anyone. I told him about the diner I went to every morning, how the waitress knew my order before I sat down. He said he wanted to go sometime. I didn't say no. One Saturday in early February, he called me. Not a text, an actual phone call, which surprised me enough that I almost didn't answer. He was organizing a basketball clinic for the middle school kids and asked if I wanted to help. It was voluntary, unpaid, just a few hours on a weekend. I should have said I was busy. I should have found an excuse. Instead, I said yes. The clinic was held in the same gym where we coached, but it felt different in the daylight. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, warming the polished floor. The kids were loud and chaotic, full of energy that made me feel older than I was. But Elias moved through the chaos easily, laughing with them, correcting their form with patience I envied. We spent hours together that day, demonstrating drills side by side, our shoulders brushing as we moved. When we showed them how to set a proper pick, he stood close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his skin. When we scrimmaged with them, he guarded me, and I felt the weight of his hands on my waist as he tried to steal the ball. The contact was innocent, necessary for the game, but it lingered in my mind long after. At the end of the clinic, we sat on the bleachers while the kids filtered out with their parents. Elias leaned back, stretching his arms above his head, exhausted but smiling. He said something about how much he'd needed this, how good it felt to just play again without the pressure of a real season. I understood what he meant. For those few hours, I'd forgotten to be careful. I'd forgotten to monitor myself, to keep my distance. I just existed, and it had felt like breathing after holding my breath for years. As we walked out to the parking lot, he asked if I wanted to grab dinner. Nothing fancy, he said, just the diner down the street. I hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. The diner was nearly empty, just a few scattered customers nursing coffee and picking at plates of fries. We slid into a booth near the back, the vinyl seats cracked and patched with duct tape. The waitress brought us menus we didn't need and water in plastic cups that sweated onto the Formica table. We talked easily, the way we had been for weeks now, but something about being there, away from school, away from the gym, felt different. More real. More dangerous. Elias told me about his last relationship. He didn't lead into it or apologize for the subject. He just started talking, his voice quiet and steady. He said he'd been with someone for 3 years, a man he'd met in the city. They'd lived together, talked about the future, made plans that felt solid. But somewhere along the way, things had fractured. He said it was his fault, mostly. He'd been restless, dissatisfied with his job, with the noise of the city, with the person he was becoming. The breakup had been messy and painful, and afterward, he'd needed to leave, to start over somewhere nobody knew him. He said coming to this town had been a kind of escape, a way to figure out who he was when he wasn't trying to be someone else. I listened without interrupting, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup I'd barely touched. His honesty disarmed me. He spoke about his life with a clarity I'd never managed, naming things I could barely admit to myself. And when he finished, he looked at me with an expression that was both vulnerable and expectant, like he was waiting for me to offer something in return. So I did. Not everything, but more than I'd given anyone in a long time. I told him about the injury, about the scholarship I'd been offered to play at a college 6 hours away, about how everyone in town had expected me to go, to make something of myself, to be the kid who got out. I told him about the surgery, the rehab, the slow realization that I could play again if I wanted to. But somewhere in that recovery, I'd lost the desire. Or maybe I'd never really had it. Maybe I'd just been good at basketball because it gave me a place to belong, a way to be seen without ever really being known. I told him I came back after 1 semester, that I told people it was because of my mother, because she needed help after my father died. And that was part of it, maybe. But the truth was simpler and harder to explain. I didn't know who I was supposed to be anywhere else. I didn't know how to want the things other people wanted. So I stayed. And I built a life here that felt manageable. Safe. Small enough that I could control it. Elias listened the way he always did, fully present, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes or try to fix anything. He just nodded slowly, like he understood something I hadn't said out loud. He told me he thought I was braver than I gave myself credit for. That staying could be just as hard as leaving. That building a life, even a quiet one, took a kind of courage most people didn't have. I didn't know if I believed him, but I wanted to. We stayed at the diner until the waitress started stacking chairs on the empty tables around us. When we finally left, the night air was cold and sharp, and I could see my breath in the glow of the streetlights. Elias walked me to my car, even though his was parked in the opposite direction. At my door, he stopped. He stood close enough that I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the way his breath misted in the cold. He said he was glad I'd come today, that it meant more to him than I probably realized. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just told him I'd see him Monday. He smiled, but there was something sad in it, something that looked like longing. The drive home felt longer than usual. I turned the radio off and drove in silence, my mind replaying every moment of the day. The way he'd looked at me during the clinic, the way his voice had softened when he talked about his past, the way he'd stood so close at my car, like he was waiting for something I didn't know how to give. At home, I paced through the dark rooms of my apartment, too restless to sit. I stood at the window and stared out at nothing, my reflection ghostly in the glass. I thought about what he'd said at the diner, about courage, about staying. But what I felt wasn't courage. It was fear. Fear of the way my heart had started to race when I saw him in the hallways. Fear of how much I'd begun to look forward to our conversations, to the sound of his laugh, to the moments when our hands brushed accidentally. Fear of the way his presence had started to fill the empty spaces in my life I pretended didn't exist. I was afraid because I knew what this was now. I couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't hide behind excuses or routines or the careful distance I'd maintained for decades. I was falling in love with him. Maybe I already had, and that terrified me more than anything else ever had. Because loving someone meant being seen. It meant letting them close enough to know the parts of me I'd spent my entire life trying to bury. It meant risking everything I'd built, every wall I'd carefully constructed, every lie I'd told myself about who I was supposed to be. I didn't know if I could do that. I didn't know if I was strong enough. But as I stood there in the dark, I realized something else too. Something just as frightening and infinitely more true. I didn't know if I could keep pretending anymore either. It happened on a Tuesday in late February. The kind of evening where the sky turned dark too early and the rain came down in sheets that blurred the world beyond the windows. We were closing up the gym again, the two of us alone in that familiar ritual. The team had left an hour before, and the building had settled into its usual quiet. Elias was sitting on the bleachers, his jacket slung over his shoulder, laughing about something one of the kids had said during practice. Something small and forgettable that somehow felt important because he was the one telling it. I stood near the center of the court, pretending to listen, but really I was just watching him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. The way he existed in that space like he belonged there, like he'd always been there. And then it hit me. Not gradually, not quietly, but all at once with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. I was in love with him. Not the careful, controlled version of affection I'd been trying to manage. Not the quiet appreciation I'd been telling myself was just friendship. This was something else entirely. Something vast and undeniable and utterly consuming. It wasn't the giddy, breathless feeling I'd read about in books or seen in movies. It was deeper than that. Quieter. It felt like recognition. Like my whole life had been leading to this moment, to this person, and everything before had just been rehearsal. I understood suddenly why nothing had ever felt right before. Why every relationship I'd attempted had felt like wearing someone else's clothes. Why I'd always felt like I was performing a version of myself that didn't quite fit. This was the truth I'd been avoiding for 34 years. Not just that I loved him, but what that meant about me. About who I'd always been underneath the carefully constructed facade. I must have gone quiet because Elias stopped talking. When I looked at him, his expression had changed. The laughter had faded, replaced by something more serious. More searching. He said I always looked like I was holding something back. The words landed like an accusation, gentle but devastating. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to lie, to deflect, to do what I'd always done. But I couldn't make myself speak. Instead, I walked to the window. The rain streaked down the glass in diagonal lines, distorting the parking lot lights into shapeless halos. I pressed my palm against the cold surface and stared out at nothing, trying to steady my breathing. I heard him stand. Heard his footsteps crossing the court toward me. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could feel his presence, but not so close that I couldn't escape if I needed to. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged. I could hear my own heartbeat. Could hear the rain hammering against the roof. Could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then he spoke, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He said my name. Just my name. But the way he said it felt like a question. Like an invitation. Like a plea. I turned slowly, finally meeting his eyes. And what I saw there made my chest tighten. He was looking at me the way I'd been looking at him when I thought he wasn't paying attention. With something raw and unguarded and terrifyingly honest. He stepped closer. Not rushing. Not pushing. Just closing the distance between us with a kind of careful deliberation. His eyes never left mine, searching for permission, for understanding, for something I didn't know if I could give. When he was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, he stopped. His voice was barely above a whisper. He said, "If I'm wrong, tell me to stop." I knew what he was asking. I knew what would happen if I didn't say anything. Every instinct I'd honed over decades screamed at me to move away, to laugh it off, to pretend I didn't understand. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I'd spent my entire life running from this moment, and I was so tired of running. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like I'd imagined. Not desperate or frantic, but soft and hesitant and almost unbearably tender. His lips brushed against mine with a gentleness that felt like an apology. Like he was trying to make up for all the time we'd both spent pretending. I felt something crack open inside me. Something I'd kept locked away for so long I'd forgotten it was there. It wasn't just desire, though that was part of it. It was recognition, relief, the feeling of finally being seen. His hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. I closed my eyes and let myself feel it. Let myself be in this moment without thinking about what came next, without planning my escape. For those few seconds, I let myself be completely, utterly honest. But then reality crashed back in. The weight of it, the impossibility of it. Everything I'd built my life around suddenly felt fragile and unstable, like a house of cards about to collapse. I pulled away, not roughly, but firmly enough that he understood. His hand fell to his side, and I saw the hurt flash across his face before he could hide it. I said we couldn't do this. The words came out hoarse, barely audible. He asked why not. Not demanding, just asking. Like he genuinely wanted to understand. I didn't have an answer that made sense. Or maybe I had too many answers, all of them tangled together. Because of where we worked. Because of this town. Because I didn't know how to be this person. Because I'd spent my whole life building walls, and I didn't know how to tear them down. Because I was terrified. I told him I was sorry. I told him I couldn't. I told him he deserved better than someone who didn't even know who they were. He said my name again, reaching for me, but I was already moving toward the door. I grabbed my jacket from the bench and walked out into the rain without looking back. The water soaked through my clothes before I even reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking, unable to turn the key. I could see the light from the gym windows reflecting off the wet pavement. Could imagine him still standing there, trying to understand what had just happened. I wanted to go back. Wanted to tell him I was wrong, that I didn't mean it, that I wanted everything I was too afraid to ask for. But I didn't. I started the car and drove home through streets that blurred behind my tears and the rain. And I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself that right up until I got home and sat in the dark and realized I'd just walked away from the only honest moment of my entire life. The days that followed were the longest of my life. I avoided him. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention, but carefully, deliberately. I changed my routine. I took my planning period in the library instead of the shared office. I left school immediately after my last class, skipping practice with an excuse about needing to catch up on grading. I parked on the opposite side of the lot and took a different entrance into the building. When I saw him in the hallways, I kept my eyes down and walked quickly, pretending I hadn't noticed him. Once, he called my name, and I pretended I hadn't heard. I felt his eyes on my back as I turned the corner, and the shame of it burned through me like acid. The other teachers noticed something was off. One of them asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed to take a day off. I told her I was fine, just tired. She didn't push, but I could see the concern in her expression. The team noticed too. They asked where I'd been, why Coach Marks wasn't at practice anymore. I told them I had other responsibilities, that Coach Rivera had everything under control. They seemed to accept it, but I caught them exchanging glances, confused by the sudden shift. I spent my evenings at home, sitting in the dark, unable to focus on anything. I tried to grade papers, but the words blurred together. I tried to read, but I couldn't follow the sentences. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. The way he'd looked at me in those seconds before the kiss. The hurt in his eyes when I pulled away. I told myself I'd done the right thing. That I was protecting both of us. That this was safer, cleaner, less complicated. That eventually the ache in my chest would fade and things would go back to normal. But they didn't. If anything, it got worse. I missed him. Not just his presence, but everything about him. The sound of his laugh. The way he listened when I talked. The ease I'd felt when we were together, like I could finally stop performing. I missed the person I'd started to become when he was around. Someone more honest, more present, more alive. I'd spent my whole life convincing myself I didn't need anyone. That I was fine on my own. That solitude was a choice, not a prison. But now, in his absence, I understood how hollow that had been. How much of my life had been about avoiding pain rather than pursuing anything real. Elias didn't avoid me. He kept showing up, kept existing in the spaces we'd shared, but he didn't push. He didn't corner me in hallways or demand explanations. He just continued being himself. Kind, professional, quietly present. And somehow that made it worse. I saw him in the gym one afternoon when I'd forgotten something in my office. He was running a drill with the team, his voice echoing across the court, and I stood in the doorway watching him for longer than I should have. When he turned and saw me, our eyes met for just a moment. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read before turning back to the players. I left without getting what I'd come for. Then, 3 weeks after that night in the gym, I heard the news. I was in the staff lounge, pouring coffee I didn't want, when the athletic director came in. He was talking to another teacher about staffing changes for the next academic year. He mentioned Elias casually, like it was common knowledge. He said Elias had accepted a position at another school, a coaching job in a different district about 40 miles away. He'd be leaving at the end of the semester. The coffee cup slipped from my hand. It shattered against the floor, ceramic and liquid spreading across the linoleum. The other teachers rushed over, asking if I was all right, helping me clean up the mess. I told them I was fine, that I'd just lost my grip. But I wasn't fine. Something inside me had fractured. He was leaving. Because of me. Because I'd pushed him away. Because I'd been too afraid to let him stay close. And now he was going somewhere else. Somewhere he could start over again. And I would be left here with the life I'd built and the walls I'd maintained and the loneliness I'd convinced myself was enough. I finished the day on autopilot, barely aware of what I was teaching, of the students in front of me. When the final bell rang, I sat at my desk and stared at the empty classroom, trying to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't just regret. It was grief. The kind that comes from knowing you had something precious and let it slip through your fingers. The kind that comes from choosing fear over truth, safety over love. I thought about all the moments we'd shared. The late nights in the gym, the basketball clinic, the diner, the way he'd looked at me before he kissed me, like I was something worth risking everything for. And I'd walked away. I'd chosen this emptiness over that possibility. I'd chosen being alone over being seen. I drove home that evening in a daze, barely noticing the traffic around me. At home, I stood in the center of my apartment and looked at all the evidence of my carefully controlled life. The trophies, the clippings, the furniture that hadn't changed in years, the walls that held nothing personal, nothing that revealed who I actually was. This was what I'd chosen. This was what I'd protected. This safe, small, half-lived existence. And for what? I sat on the couch and put my head in my hands, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not quietly, not carefully, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and broken. The kind that sounds like all the years of holding back finally releasing at once. When I finally stopped, my face was wet and my chest ached, and I felt hollowed out. But I also felt something else. Something I hadn't expected. Clarity. I couldn't let him leave without telling him the truth. Not the careful, measured truth I'd spent my life offering people, but the real truth. The one I'd been too afraid to speak out loud. I didn't know if it would change anything. I didn't know if it was too late. But I knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. His last day was Friday. I had 3 days to find the courage I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. 3 days to decide if I wanted to keep hiding, or if I was finally ready to be seen. Friday came too quickly and not quickly enough. I spent the day in a fog, moving through my classes without really being present. Every time I passed the gym, I felt my resolve weaken. By the final bell, I'd convinced myself a dozen times to let him go, and a dozen times I'd changed my mind again. When the building emptied, I walked slowly toward the gym. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself he might not even be there, that he might have already left, that this whole thing was pointless. But when I pushed through the double doors, he was standing in the center of the court. Just standing there under those same humming lights, looking at the empty space like he was memorizing it. He turned when he heard me enter. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt fragile, like any sudden movement might shatter it. I walked toward him slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I was close enough to see his eyes clearly, I stopped. I didn't know how to begin, didn't know how to say what I'd come to say, so I just started talking. I told him I'd spent my whole life afraid of being seen, that I'd built walls so high I'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side of them, that I'd convinced myself that safety was the same as happiness, that being alone was easier than being honest. I told him that when he looked at me, I wasn't invisible anymore, that for the first time in my life, someone had seen past the careful facade I'd constructed, past the person I pretended to be, and had somehow still wanted to stay. My voice cracked when I told him I was sorry. Sorry for running. Sorry for being too afraid. Sorry for wasting the time we could have had together. Elias took a step closer, and I could see his eyes were wet. He didn't speak. He just waited, letting me finish. I told him I didn't know how to do this. Didn't know how to be the person he deserved. That I'd spent so long hiding that I wasn't sure I knew how to stop. That I was terrified of what it meant, of what people would think, of all the ways it could go wrong. But I told him the truth too. The one I'd been too afraid to speak out loud. I told him I loved him. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating and true. I'd never said them to anyone before. Not like this. Not with this much weight behind them. Elias exhaled slowly, and a tear slid down his cheek. He reached out, his hand finding mine, and he held it like it was something precious. He said he loved me too, that he'd known for weeks, that he'd been waiting, hoping I'd find the courage to stop running. Then he asked me what happened next, what I wanted, what I was willing to risk. I told him I didn't know, that I couldn't promise it would be easy, or that I wouldn't be afraid, that this town was small and people talked, and I didn't know if I was ready for what that meant. But I told him I was tired of pretending, tired of living a half-life, tired of being alone. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel his breath. He told me he wasn't asking for promises. He was just asking me not to disappear. Our goodbye was quiet. No grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. Just a long, steady look that said everything words couldn't. His hand in mine. The understanding that this was just the beginning of something, not the end. He told me he'd call, that the new job wasn't that far away, that if I wanted this, we'd figure it out together. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. And then he left, and I was alone in that empty gym again. But it felt different this time. Months passed. The season ended. The team moved on to summer leagues, and the building grew quiet. I walked through the gym at dusk sometimes, when no one else was around, and I thought about everything that had happened there. The moment he'd asked me to stay. The kiss. The confession. One evening, I found a basketball on the bench near the bleachers. It was old, the leather worn smooth, and I saw his initials marked faintly on the side in black ink. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and something in my chest loosened. At home, I sat at my desk and wrote him a letter. Not one I'd send, but one I needed to write anyway. I thanked him for seeing me, for being patient, for not giving up even when I'd given him every reason to. I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with the other pieces of my life I wasn't ready to let go of. Then I walked to the window and looked out at the empty street, at the gym across the way with its lights still on. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. I looked the same as I always had, but something had shifted underneath. I wasn't lighter. I wasn't suddenly unafraid. But I was honest now. Finally, painfully, completely honest. Outside, the rain started again, soft and familiar. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and let myself feel everything I'd spent so long trying to avoid. The fear, the hope, the possibility of something real. The empty gym across the street sat in darkness now, but I could still hear the echoes. The sound of a basketball bouncing, the squeak of shoes on polished floors. Two voices in the quiet, asking each other to stay. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. It felt like an ending, but it felt like a beginning too.